What would you do if your daughter was humiliated right in front of you, just because of the color of her skin? A young black woman was called the police by a flight attendant, falsely accused, just because she was carrying a bag that looked too expensive to be hers. And as tensions reached a boiling point, everyone in the airport held their breath until her father walked in. No one knew. He was the CEO of the airline. But this story isn't about power. It's about choice. The choice between anger and compassion, between reaction and understanding. If you were that father, what would you do? Would you scream for justice? Or would you teach the world that kindness is true power? Try to put yourself in their shoes in that moment. Would you choose the light or the dark? This is not just a story about discrimination. It is a journey of compassion, of awakening, and of a lesson that made the world silent. Please like, share, and subscribe to join me in this emotional story where compassion becomes the greatest power. The airport loudspeakers blared intermittently, like sighs on a cold morning. AeroVista Flight 417 to Boston will be boarding at Gate C-14. A stream of people poured toward the gate, the sound of suitcases rolling on the floor, the sound of children crying, the sound of men complaining about being late for meetings. In the middle of the stream, Zoe Carter walked slowly. Her gray hoodie was pulled up high, her eyes on the electronic board, her hand clutching a faded tote bag. She looked calm, but there was something tired in her eyes. She arrived early, not because she was afraid of being late, but because she wanted to avoid the eyes of others. She was used to the way a few eyes lingered on her skin color, not hostile, just unfamiliar. But today, all she wanted to do was get on the plane, get to Boston in time to give her mother the medicine before chemotherapy. At the gate, Linda Maynard was checking tickets. Her uniform was neat. Her hair was tied up. Her voice was clear and cut through the air. She was a veteran flight attendant, someone many younger staff both respected and feared. She had spent 10 years flying international flights, but was now being reassigned to domestic flights due to personnel reorganization. Pressure, fatigue, and a wounded pride had left her stiff. It was Zoe's turn. She smiled and handed over her boarding pass. Linda glanced at her, then down at the tote bag on Zoe's shoulder. "Ma'am, your bag is too big. You need to check your bag." Linda's voice was cold and emotionless. Zoe was momentarily taken aback. "This bag is smaller than carry-on size." "Ma'am, I've flown AeroVista many times and have never been told." "It doesn't matter. Today, I said no. Put the bag up to a sizer." Zoe placed the bag in the metal sizer. It fit perfectly. No bulges, no dents. A few passengers behind her nodded it clearly fit, but Linda didn't look. She just crossed her arms and said softly, just loud enough to be heard, "Rules are rules, and people like you always find a way to bend them." The words fell, heavy as a stone. A middle-aged man behind her looked up. A brown-skinned woman shook her head slightly. Zoe stood still. She heard the words, "People like you," clearly a phrase she had heard hundreds of times, each time with a different nuance, but always the same meaning. You are different. You don't belong here. She took a deep breath. "You can call your supervisor to confirm. My bag contains prescription drugs that need to be kept on my person. If you want, I can take it out for you to see." Linda smiled faintly. "No need to see. I won't argue. If you don't comply, I'll call security." A murmur began to rise. Someone started filming. Another whispered, "It's just a bag." Zoe tried to keep her voice calm. "I was just suggesting a reasonable solution." "There is nothing to solve," Linda replied, then turned to the staff next to her. "Alex, call the police to gate C-14. The word police silenced the crowd. Someone stepped back. Zoe felt as if the world had shrunk to a small circle around her and all eyes were on it. A white boy about 10 years old pulled his mother's hand and asked softly, "Mom, why did they call the police on her?" The mother replied softly, "I don't know. Son, maybe because adults sometimes forget what's really important." Zoe heard, and it made her eyes sting. But she stood still, not moving. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just looked at Linda. 1 second, 2 seconds. Linda avoided his gaze, but then turned back, gritting her teeth. "You're causing trouble. Please step aside." Zoe stepped over. Her shoes made a crisp sound on the floor. She looked out the window. Snow was falling lightly on the runway. The flakes were small and swirling in the wind, as if lost like the feeling in her heart. A security guard came over and asked quietly, "What's going on here?" Linda quickly replied. The passenger did not follow the flight crew's instructions and was acting rebelliously. Zoe wanted to react, but held back. In her head, her father's voice echoed like a distant memory. "You can't control how they look at you, but you can control how you stand, how you talk, how you carry yourself." She pursed her lips. Her voice was calm. "Officer, I just want to board my flight. I have a ticket and valid luggage. I am not resisting." The policeman looked at the two women, then looked around. The crowd was breathless, silent. Someone was still filming. Linda suddenly felt her hands shaking. She knew everyone was watching, judging. But she also heard a voice in her head, the cold voice of her old boss. "Don't miss your flight. If someone causes trouble, we'll kick them out. No negotiation." She couldn't afford to miss it anymore. She couldn't afford to be judged as indecisive. So she stiffened her voice. "Officer, please escort her out of this area." The words hit like a hammer. Zoe took a deep breath, her heart pounding. She looked around. There were pitying eyes, fearful eyes, and indifferent eyes. She held the phone. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her voice, when she spoke, was strangely gentle. "I'll call my supervisor." No one knew who she was calling. Linda gave a small, half-sarcastic laugh. "Go ahead, bub, but hurry. We have a plane to catch." Zoe turned and walked to the quiet corner by the glass door. She dialed a number, a long ring. Then a deep voice came from the other end. "Zoe, where are you?" she whispered. "Gate C-14. They won't let me board the plane." "Dad." There was silence on the other end of the line for a few seconds. Then there was only one short, slow, clear sentence. "Stay there. Don't do anything. Dad's coming." She hung up. She remained silent. Her hand tightened on the tote bag inside. The still warm vial. Outside, the loudspeaker blared again. Flight 417 to Boston is delayed 15 minutes, and in that moment, amidst the bustling crowd, Linda Maynard suddenly felt a chill run down her spine, not from the air conditioning, but from the young girl's gaze looking at her. There was no hatred in those eyes, only sadness, and a calmness that made others afraid. No one knew that the only valuable thing in the faded bag that Zoe Carter carried over her shoulder was not a wallet or a laptop, but 3 vials of medicine in a small thermal bag. They were for her mother, Marilyn Carter, who was in a small hospital in Boston. The medicine was not available to the public. Only Zoe, with her medical student ID and a few friends from the research lab, could bring them back in time for her weekend treatment. 12 hours before standing at Gate C-14, Zoe was still in the Harvard University lab. It was raining. She wore wet sneakers, carefully labeling each bottle of medicine. A groupmate joked that she always worked as if she were carrying the weight of the world. She just smiled and said nothing. She knew she couldn't save her mother by her own strength, but at least she could do everything to keep her from suffering any more. Then the phone vibrated. A message from Dad. "Your mother is weaker than yesterday, but she still asks when you will come home." She looked at the screen for a long time. Then she typed only 3 words. "I'm coming." Zoe grew up in a family where composure was armor. Her father, Daniel Carter, was a pilot. After decades of hard work, he became CEO of AeroVista Airlines. But despite his success, he was the first black person to hold that position. He knew the skeptical looks, the meetings where he had to speak twice to hear half. So, from a young age, Zoe learned to stay calm in every situation. The calmer you are, the less reason others have to put you down, her father often said. And now, in the cold air of O'Hare Airport, that sentence echoed in my head like a reminder. Zoe sat down in the waiting chair, still clutching her tote bag. She looked out the window at the planes lined up for takeoff. The yellow lights reflected off the snow, making the runway glow silver. She had always loved that image, planes leaving the ground, heading skyward. To her, flying was a symbol of freedom, but freedom wasn't for everyone in the same way. The sound of high heels echoed. Linda walked past, still cold. She didn't look at Zoe, just glanced at her, as if she were an obstacle. Zoe didn't respond. She closed her eyes, trying to stay calm, but inside, a small part of her was trembling with fear. Not fear of the police or missing the flight, but fear of the image of her mother waiting in the hospital room, believing that her daughter would come home. In that moment, memories flooded back. She remembered the first time she and her father flew on a plane as a child. A man sitting next to her told the flight attendant, "I don't want to sit next to them." Her father smiled, changed seats, and said nothing. As the plane took off, he just looked at his daughter and whispered, "Don't let others decide your worth." Zoe had carried that sentence in her heart for 15 years. And now, in the middle of Gate C-14, she understood that she was standing exactly where her father had stood, the line between silence and resistance. A young woman came over and sat down nearby, her eyes worried. "I recorded what happened," she said quietly. "If you need any proof, I have video." Zoe looked surprised. "Thank you, but I'm fine." The girl smiled sadly. "No one is okay with being treated like that. I've been there too." Zoe thanked him, but said nothing more. She didn't want to turn this into a fight. She just wanted it to be over. But deep down, she knew there were some things that, if left unsaid, would continue. About 10 minutes later, the phone rang, a message from Dad. "On the way. 10 minutes." She looked around. The gate was starting to quiet down. A few people were whispering. A few were filming for the internet. The atmosphere was strange, as if everyone knew they were witnessing something more than just a passenger incident. Linda stood at the check-in desk, trying not to look at Zoe, but her hands were shaking slightly. She didn't like this feeling of being judged, this feeling of having gone too far. But in her head, tired memories flooded back the time she was yelled at by customers, the meetings where her younger boss looked down on her, the text messages announcing job transfers without anyone asking why. She told herself she was just following the rules, but there was a part of her that knew it wasn't just the rules. It was anger building up, unleashed on the first person who couldn't fight back. Meanwhile, Zoe pulled out a small notebook. The leather cover was soft, the edges frayed. Inside were scribbles, medical notes, and a few short poems. She opened it to the middle page, where it was written in her mother's handwriting, "You will meet people who will make you doubt yourself. When they do, remember, you are a small light in the cold wind. And a light, however small, is still a light." Zoe pursed her lips. A long sigh escaped. She said softly to herself, "The light must not be turned off." She raised her head, her eyes calm. Gate C-14 was still lit up with boarding lights. It was still snowing outside, but the atmosphere was different, as if everything was waiting for something to happen. A security guard passed by and stopped to ask Linda in a low voice, "Is everything okay?" Linda just nodded. Okay. But her voice was dry and uncertain. Zoe looked at her watch. 3 minutes to go. She knew her father never missed an appointment. She had no idea what he was planning, only that if he said don't do anything, there was a reason. She stood up, adjusted her hoodie, and walked to the window. A plane taxied slowly, its red lights flashing rhythmically. The light reflected off the floor, lengthening Zoe's shadow. She looked at the silhouette, thin, slender, but steady. A passenger passing by whispered, "That girl is so strong." Zoe couldn't hear it, but she felt it. She took a deep breath and gently smoothed her hair back. A strange feeling rose in her heart at that moment, a sense of calm and anticipation. Then the loudspeaker rang out. The female staff's voice trembled slightly. "Please be informed. Flight 417 is temporarily delayed boarding to resolve a technical issue." Zoe knew it wasn't a technical problem. Something was coming. An automatic door opened at the end of the corridor. A cold wind rushed in. A man in a gray suit stepped out. Not too fast, not too slow. His face was calm. His eyes were determined. He walked straight towards gate C14. Linda raised her head, frowning slightly. "Who are you? This area does not allow." But she stopped mid-sentence, because everyone around her recognized that face, the face that had appeared in business magazines and national airline news. Daniel Carter, CEO of AeroVista Airlines. Zoe saw him, said nothing. Just a very small smile, just enough to be noticed. The father nodded slightly. No words were needed. No introductions were needed. His presence caused the already noisy atmosphere to suddenly become still, as if everyone held their breath. Linda suddenly felt a chill in her hand. She swallowed and took a half step back. The man in front of her was the father of the girl she had just called the police for. No one said anything. Only the loudspeaker's slow, lingering voice lingered in the air. "Flight 417 will depart after further notice." And then, all eyes in the airport turned to one point, where two black men, father and son, stood side by side, silently facing the world. Linda Maynard had been on her feet for 4 hours this morning. Her feet were numb and her black high heels as confining as her mood. When she was younger, she had been proud of her job as a flight attendant. She loved the feeling of flying, of seeing the world through the small windows of the plane. But now, every flight was a cycle, ascending, descending, smiling, enduring, and ending with some complaint from a passenger or manager. Being 48 doesn't make her weak, but it does make her feel invisible. Young colleagues, with their new uniforms and shiny phones, talk about TikTok, about photo trips. They call her Sister Linda with a cute smile, but in her eyes, she sees the distance. They don't know that she was once a chief instructor for an international flight team. She was once awarded for saving a passenger with a heart attack in the air. She was someone everyone respected. Then the company changed its policy. The old-timers were reassigned to domestic routes. The superiors said it was an opportunity to share their experience with the new generation. But Linda understood it was a polite way of saying, "It's time to make way." This morning, when she arrived for work, she was feeling tired. The coffee maker was broken. Her colleagues were late. There was a long line of passengers, and an internal announcement from management Flight 417 must depart on time. Absolutely, because there are inspectors checking the operational capacity. That sentence was like a knife hanging over her head. She knew that if there was just one small incident, one troublesome passenger, the whole group would be reported, and she, the person in charge of boarding, would be held responsible. Then Zoe appeared, the dark-skinned girl, quiet in appearance but with a look that was too calm. Linda had seen that kind of look before, the look of someone who believed they were right and would fight to the end. And in Linda's world, those looks always meant trouble. She wasn't trying to discriminate. At least, she told herself so. She was just tired. just wanting things to go smoothly. But deep down, there was another voice, vague but real. Why do I have to give in? Why do I always have to give in? The voice made her colder, her voice sharper. People like you always find a way to bend the rules. The words slipped from her lips before she could think, and as they did, she felt a few eyes turn to her. But it was too late. Linda turned away, pretending not to see Zoe place the bag in the snug-fitting sizer. She needed to assert control. In a world where everything was moving so fast, this small power made her feel alive. Now, when Daniel Carter walked in, her heart sank. She recognized him immediately. Everyone in aviation knew Daniel Carter, the first black man to head a major airline, the man Time magazine once called Captain of Change. Linda had admired him. She remembered the day he was appointed, and the whole office was saying, "This is the beginning of a new era." She believed it. But that belief faded. As the company began to cut jobs, she saw people like herself being pushed aside while the diversity policies were praised in the media. She didn't hate Daniel Carter, but she felt bitter. As he approached, his eyes were calm, not angry, not urgent. That scared Linda even more. She swallowed, her voice trembling slightly. Mr. Carter, I didn't know she was." He stopped before her, his voice low but warm. "You don't need to know who she is to treat her fairly." No one said anything. Everyone around her fell silent. Linda felt as if the air had thickened. She wanted to say that she was just following the rules, but the words got stuck in her throat. Zoe stood silently behind, saying nothing. She looked at her father, then at the woman before her. There was no anger in her eyes, only deep sadness. Linda suddenly thought of her daughter. She was Zoe's age, a senior in college in Florida. They hadn't spoken in 2 months since their fight over majors. "You're so bossy," her daughter yelled, and hung up. Linda considered calling back, but then decided against it. She didn't know where to start. Now, looking at Zoe, she suddenly saw a shadow of her daughter in her. She wanted to say something, but Daniel stepped forward, signaling the security guard to stay back. His voice remained gentle. "I don't want to see anyone dragged off a flight over a misunderstanding. We can resolve this without the police." Linda bit her lip. "I was just following the rules." Daniel looked her straight in the eye. "Then show me the law that says passengers are not worthy of respect." There was no answer. The whole airport was silent. A technician standing 10 meters away stopped working and looked in their direction. Linda felt a flush rise in her neck. For the first time in years, she felt truly ashamed. Not because of the scolding, but because she realized she had become the person she had once disapproved of. 20 years ago, early in her career, she stood up for a passenger who was being discriminated against because of the color of her skin. Back then, she believed that people deserved respect no matter where they were. Now, she was using her small power to hurt others. Daniel turned to Zoe. "Are you okay?" Zoe nodded. "I'm fine, Dad. We'll talk later," he said softly, then turned back to Linda. "Thank you for keeping the passengers safe. But today, you forgot the rest of your job keeping respect." Linda stood still, her eyes stinging. No one knew, but inside her, something had just collapsed. After Daniel left the gate to talk to the supervisor, Linda sat down in her chair. Her hands were shaking, and she had to take off her gloves to breathe. A young employee approached. "Linda, are you okay?" She pursed her lips. Fine. But inside, she knew things had changed. The loudspeaker announced the flight delay. Passengers began to leave. Linda looked around. The airport was gradually emptying. The girl who had taken the video walked by, her eyes wary but not angry. Linda called her daughter. No one answered. She left a message, her voice hoarse. I just wanted to say, I miss you." She hung up and looked back at the metal sizer in the corner. Zoe's bag was still there, neat, a perfect fit. Linda stepped forward and placed her hand on the sizer's frame. The metal was cold. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in years, she felt tears fall. Not because she lost face, but because she knew she had just lost something more important, the kindness she had believed in. At that moment, she had no idea that, just a few minutes later, this whole story would spread, and her life would take a completely different turn. The loudspeaker voice blared one last time. "Flight 417 is scheduled to depart after announcement from the General Director." Linda raised her head. That name, the CEO, was now not only someone she once admired, but someone who forced her to face herself. She knew it was unavoidable. Today, at Gate C-14, there is not only a delayed flight, there is also a person standing in the middle of the runway of life, waiting for the opportunity to take off again. The atmosphere in the waiting area of Gate C-14 became thick. Something hung in the air, a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity among the crowd. Passengers no longer paid attention to flight times. All eyes turned to a scene that no one expected to happen in the middle of the airport, the most powerful black CEO in the U.S. airline industry, facing one of his own airline's flight attendants. Daniel Carter walked slowly, each step as heavy as a clock ticking down. No one dared to speak. The light reflected off the stone floor made him stand out, straight and steady as a pillar. His eyes were deep and strangely calm. He needed no introduction. That face had appeared in every AeroVista advertising campaign, with the slogan, "Fly with respect." Fly with respect. Linda swallowed. She tried to keep her posture, but her palms were sweating. It felt like hundreds of eyes were on her. What had been a small conversation just minutes ago had turned into a storm. One passenger took out his phone to film, and several others live-streamed. Linda knew that anything she said now could be cut, shared, and spread across the internet. Daniel stopped a few steps away from her, looked her straight in the eye, his voice low but clear. "Are you in charge of this area?" Linda nodded, trying to regain her composure. "Yes, sir. I didn't know she was—" Daniel interrupted. "She's a passenger, and my passengers don't need titles to be treated with respect." Each word fell like a thin slice. The cameraman lowered his phone, as if caught up in the words. Linda opened her mouth to explain, but no sound came out. Zoe stood still. In the white light of the airport, her face looked impassive, but inside she was a whirlwind. She didn't want this to turn into a duel between her father and the flight attendant. She knew her father. He wasn't acting out of anger, but out of a belief that every system needed to be held accountable for its actions. Her father turned to the crowd, his voice calm but firm. "Sorry for the interruption. We will get it over with as soon as possible. But before we do, I need everyone to understand no one should be humiliated just because someone else is having a bad day." A small round of applause erupted from the back row. Then a few more. Linda bowed her head, feeling as if the ground were slipping from under her. She remembered every shift, every little complaint, every time she swallowed her anger. But she never thought she would be standing here, being admonished in front of dozens of people by the man who represented the company. Daniel lowered his voice, turning to Linda. "I don't care how big the bag is. I care why you decided to call the police on a girl trying to visit her sick mother. Did you do it out of respect for the rules, or out of pride?" Linda took a half step back. I was just following procedure. The airline requires discipline. If I were to be flexible, the flight would be delayed." Daniel looked straight at her. "Do you think a few minutes late is worth more than human honor?" The question went unanswered. Only the loudspeaker echoed from afar, calling for another flight. Zoe stepped forward, gently placing a hand on her father's arm. "Dad, it's okay. I'm fine." Her voice was soft, but firm. Daniel turned, his eyes softening. "No, Zoe, not just for you. For everyone who has been treated like this and no one has spoken up." His words made many people bow their heads. A young man in the front row spoke up. "You are right. We have all been silent for too long." Linda felt a lump in her throat. The anger from earlier had vanished, replaced by a feeling of emptiness. She wanted to apologize, but she feared that an apology would only make her feel smaller. Daniel turned to the airport manager, Alex Grant, who was still standing in the corner. "Are you the shift supervisor?" Alex hurried forward. "Yes, sir." "Then I need a report of the entire passenger processing procedure at this gate, and send it in today." Alex nodded, his face pale. Then Daniel turned to Linda, his voice still calm but colder. "You should stop your duties for now. I don't want to make any hasty decisions. Go home, rest, and think about why you chose this career in the first place." Linda was drained. She nodded, stepping back, her heart racing. Murmurs arose everywhere, either pity or judgment. She left, but his words still echoed in her head. "Think back to why you chose this career." As the door closed behind her, Zoe turned to her father. "Are you sure this is the right thing to do?" Daniel was silent for a few seconds. "There is no absolute right, my dear. But sometimes people only change when they are forced to stop and look at themselves." He looked around and saw that everyone was still standing. He said reassuringly, "I apologize to everyone. We will depart again after the procedure has been reviewed. AeroVista always wants every flight to be a safe journey, both technically and in the hearts of people." The statement made a few people smile. The atmosphere gradually eased. Zoe sat down in her chair and took a deep breath. She wasn't exactly happy. She just felt like a door had opened not for her, but for many others. She thought of her mother, of the evenings they'd watch the news, when her mother would say, "Someday the world will be more fair, if enough people dare to do what's right." She smiled. Maybe her mother would be proud when she heard what happened today. Meanwhile, Linda sat alone in the staff room. She looked at the name tag, Linda M., on the table. Her fingers trembled as she touched it. In the hallway outside, the loudspeakers still echoed, the familiar sound of the job she had been doing for nearly half her life. But today, it sounded strange. She turned on her phone. Her inbox was flooded with messages. Several people had sent videos of the incident. One friend said, "Get ready, it's going viral." Linda closed her eyes. There was nothing to defend, only exhaustion. But amid the exhaustion, there was a faint light, the feeling that maybe she needed to change, however late. Outside the gate, Zoe and Daniel were still sitting side by side. He put his hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry you had to go through this, but you did the right thing. You kept your cool, and that's what made them look back." Zoe looked at her father and smiled slightly. "You know, when they said people like you, I wasn't angry. I just felt sorry for them, because maybe they've never been treated fairly by anyone, so they don't know how to treat others fairly." Daniel nodded. "That's why I never let anger fly. It makes you forget where you're going." Zoe leaned her head against her father's shoulder. Outside, the snow was still falling lightly, as if no storm had ever passed. But everyone knew the real storm was just beginning, online, in the public, and in the eyes of everyone who had witnessed it that morning. Gate C-14 was quiet again, but the reverberations of this story would be felt far beyond the runway, far beyond the borders of one airline. Because there, a young girl and her father turned a small act into a turning point of self-respect and justice. As the security team's green lights reflected off the airport floor, everyone knew the situation had gone beyond a little argument. A pair of officers appeared in the hallway leading to Gate C-14. Heavy footsteps echoed through the already tense space. One was a white, middle-aged man with a stocky build. The other was younger, of Latin descent, with kind but wary eyes. They approached, between two rows of passengers standing to either side. Officer Miller, the shift commander that day, stepped in, his voice calm. "What's going on here?" Linda tried to remain professional, but her voice trembled slightly. "This passenger refused to comply with crew instructions. I was forced to call security as per protocol." Daniel Carter stood beside his daughter, his eyes calm. "Thank you for coming, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. She's not causing trouble. She's just being denied boarding for no good reason." Zoe said nothing. She stood between them, feeling the dozens of eyes on her. Her heart beat slowly, but steadily. In that moment, she remembered the first time her father had taught her to control her fear. "When you feel cornered," he had said, "don't see them as enemies. See them as people, because only then will you not lose yourself." Officer Miller looked around, his eyes landing on Zoe. He noticed that she didn't seem like a rebel. She was young, petite, and calm, which made him a little uneasy. He lowered his voice. "What's your name, Zoe Carter?" She replied. His eyes changed slightly. The last name Carter was familiar. He glanced at the AeroVista billboard on the wall. There was a picture of a black man in a gray suit, smiling confidently. In bold letters, Daniel Carter, CEO of AeroVista Airlines. Miller looked at the man standing next to Zoe, then back at the board. He let out a small breath, understanding what was going on, but he kept his voice neutral. "I understand. Is anyone being threatened or aggressive?" Linda was confused. "No, but she argued with me and slowed down the boarding process. Arguing is not illegal." "Ma'am," Daniel said, his voice low but powerful. Miller nodded. "That's right. If no one is dangerous, I suggest everyone handle it internally. We don't need to make a big deal out of this." Linda was silent. She felt small between these two men, one representing the law, the other representing power. Zoe looked at Miller, her voice soft. "I just want to get on a plane to go home to my mother. She's in the hospital in Boston. I have medicine for her." The younger officer bowed his head slightly and said softly, "We understand, ma'am." That simple statement almost brought Zoe to tears. She didn't need to be defended, just listened to. Daniel turned to Linda. "Do you still think she's a threat?" Linda bowed her head and shook her head slightly. "No, sir." "Very well," he said, then turned to Officer Miller. "Thank you for coming. I will ensure this situation is handled properly, but within the company." Miller nodded. "I know you will do the right thing. Mr. Carter, we will retreat." The two officers turned to leave. Before leaving, Miller paused, looked at Zoe, his voice soft as a personal message. "Girl, take care of your mother, and don't let anyone make you doubt your worth." Zoe nodded, thanking him. When they were gone, the silence was quiet again, but this time it was different, heavier, filled with unspoken emotion. Linda felt as if she were standing in a blinding light, her every mistake exposed. She didn't know what to say. Finally, she just whispered, "I'm sorry." Daniel looked at her, nodding slightly. "An apology is a good start, but don't just apologize for being seen. Apologize for wanting to change." Linda was speechless. Zoe looked at her, her eyes strangely gentle. "I'm not angry with you. I just want us to not be afraid of each other every time there's a misunderstanding." The statement made Linda turn away. She didn't expect the offended person to speak to her in that tone. Daniel turned to his daughter. "Zoe, you can come back on the next flight. I'll handle the rest." "No," Zoe said. "I will stay. You taught me that silence, in the face of injustice, is part of the wrong. I want to see this fixed, not just apologized for." Daniel's eyes flashed with pride. "Okay, I'll stay. He turned back to Alex Grant, the gate agent, who was standing stiffly in the corner. "Please delay the flight by 20 minutes. I want to speak to everyone on duty." Alex nodded, his voice trembling. "Yes, sir." The loudspeaker announced, "Flight 417 to Boston will be delayed again due to an internal incident. Please wait for further announcements." A few sighs, a few small complaints, but for the most part, the passengers remained silent. They knew they were witnessing something bigger than a delayed flight. Daniel stood in the middle, looking at the group of employees. His voice was low but warm. "Today, I am not just speaking as a director. I am speaking as someone who has been in her position, someone who has been doubted just because of the color of her skin, just because she did not fit the mold. I understand the fatigue of this job. I understand the pressure. But when the pressure makes you forget compassion, that is when you lose sight of why you do this job." The whole area was silent. The young employees bowed their heads. Linda did not dare look up. Daniel continued, his voice slow as if telling a story. "I was stopped at the boarding gate like this once, many years ago, when I was a pilot. They said I couldn't be a captain because I didn't look like someone who could fly a plane. I'll never forget that feeling, and I swore if one day I had the power to change that, I would." Zoe listened, her heart sinking. She understood why her father wasn't angry. He was used to the pain. He just didn't want to see it happen again. When Daniel finished, he looked at Linda again. "I'm not firing you today, but I want you to leave the gate and take a few days off. Think about what just happened, and remember that justice is never the enemy of the rules." Linda nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you for giving me the chance." He nodded slightly. "Opportunity is always there, as long as we dare to face mistakes." Zoe walked closer to Linda and said softly, "I hope you're okay. And if you can, call your daughter tonight." Linda was startled. "How did you know I have a daughter?" Zoe smiled. "I guess. A mother has that look in her eyes when she worries about her child." Linda was silent. Those words, simple but profound. As Linda left the area, Daniel put his hand on his daughter's shoulder. "You just taught her something the entire system might not have been able to do." Zoe smiled. "I'm just saying what you told me." The lights in the airport gradually dimmed. The passengers began to clap lightly. No one asked, but everyone felt the need to do something to break the tension. Daniel bowed slightly in thanks. Zoe smiled, her eyes slightly moist. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The wet runway reflected the lights, shimmering like a mirror. That day, in the middle of gate, C-14 justice did not come with a whistle or handcuffs. It came with a girl's calm voice and a father's compassionate gaze. After the police left, the space at gate C-14 was still silent. Zoe sat back in the waiting chair, her eyes looking out the glass door, where the snow was still falling in thin strands. She felt like she had just walked through a storm, but instead of being crushed, there was a strange sense of relief inside. Daniel Carter stood a few feet away, on the phone with a senior executive at the firm. His voice was deep and firm, but at times it would soften, as if he were coaxing the minds of a giant system. He didn't shout at anyone, just talked about respect, corporate culture, and human values. Those words, on his lips, weren't slogans. They were the result of decades of suffering, burden, and perseverance. Zoe looked at her father, her heart filled with admiration. She remembered when she was a child, when he was a captain. She had followed him into the cockpit once. He pointed to the dashboard filled with buttons and said, "Flying is more than just knowing how to fly. It's about finding the balance between control and trust." Now she understood what he meant. Her phone rang. It was Boston Hospital. She quickly picked it up. The nurse's voice on the other end was soft but urgent. "Zoe, your mother has just been transferred to the intensive care unit. She is weak, but conscious. She keeps asking when you will be home. She clenched the phone, her voice trembling. I will be there tonight. She hung up and looked up. Daniel was back, his eyes questioning. Mom Zoe nodded, pursing her lips. She's fine, but I have to go home soon. He looked at his watch. The plane is scheduled to leave in 40 minutes. We'll be there in time. Zoe nodded slightly, but then fell silent. She couldn't shake the turmoil of emotions that flooded her sadness, grief and gratitude. In the distance, Linda emerged from the staff room. She had changed into a coat, her hair tied back. Her eyes were tired, but something was different. When she saw Zoe, she stopped. Then, after a few seconds of hesitation, she walked forward. Zoe, her voice was hoarse. I know nothing is enough, but I am truly sorry. Zoe smiled slightly. I know. Linda looked at her, then took a deep breath. I just called my daughter. I haven't had the courage to call her in 2 months. But you're right. A mother shouldn't let her pride keep her silent. Zoe listened, her eyes slightly moist. I'm glad you called. Linda nodded, relieved. She looked at Daniel. Thank you for not firing me. If I fire you, I'll just scare you, Daniel replied calmly. I want you to remember. Linda bowed her head. I will remember, and I will be different. A moment later, she left. Her steps were light, but perhaps for the first time in years, she left without feeling empty. Daniel sat down next to his daughter. You see, one phone call can change someone's life. Zoe nodded, like the call your mother got from the hospital. He looked at her, his eyes warm. Or like your father's call, from when you were little, saying, never apologize for being yourself. Zoe laughed softly, tears rolling down her face. You always know what to say. The loudspeaker blared. Boarding for Flight 417 to Boston is underway. Priority passengers, please. Daniel stood up and held out his hand to his daughter. Come on, we have someone waiting. As they entered the boarding gate, several passengers stood up and applauded, not because they recognized him, but because they felt they had witnessed something rare in this hurried life. On the plane, Zoe sat by the window. The afternoon light fell on her face, making her eyes sparkle. Daniel sat next to her, opened his laptop, and sent a quick email to the board topic gate C14. Lessons from this morning's incident. No policy is strong enough without compassion. We will reopen the passenger respect training, not to punish, but to reignite our reason for being. He paused, looking at Zoe. You know, sometimes the biggest changes start with a small mistake. She nodded, like a little gust of wind can change the direction of a flight. They both smiled. The plane taxied down the runway, sunlight filtering through the snow, reflecting off the pale gray sky. Zoe put her hand on her medicine bag, thinking of her mother. She knew that when this flight landed, it would not just be the end of a journey, but the beginning of something new. She took out her phone, opened the message, and quickly wrote to Linda, thanks for calling my daughter. I'm sure she'll do well. The message was sent, then disappeared into the signal stream. Daniel looked over. Did you just text her? Yes, Zoe said. My mother used to say, if someone is trying to change, the best thing you can do is believe them. He nodded slightly. Your mother is right. Always right. The plane lifted off, the fuselage shaking slightly. Zoe closed her eyes, feeling the engine's steady heartbeat. Below, Chicago shrank, the buildings, the streets, and even Gate C14 now a tiny dot. But for Zoe, it would forever be where she learned that sometimes justice doesn't require shouting. It just requires the courage to stand still and not bow. In the sky, the sun gradually emerged from the clouds. Daniel turned around and said softly, You know, If it weren't for today, I probably would never have realized that there are still many people who need to be reminded that kindness never goes out of style. Zoe laughed, her voice whispering, "You speak like a father, not a CEO. Maybe because today, I just want to be a father." Zoe leaned her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes. Outside, the snow melted into water, sparkling in the sunlight like drops of glass. Elsewhere, in her small suburban Chicago apartment, Linda sat at the kitchen table, her phone still on. A text message from Zoe popped up, just a few lines, but it made her cry. She pressed the callback button. "Hello, baby. It's Mom." On the other end, the daughter's voice choked up. "I knew you would call. Mom." There was no more silence between the two ends of the line. There was only the sound of breathing, light and human. In that moment, in many different places, in an airplane cabin flying in the sky, in a small apartment, in an office at the company headquarters, people who seemed to be strangers were connected by the only thing that did not require language compassion. And then, at gate C14, the cleaning staff found a small notebook that had fallen under the chair. The first page was written in soft handwriting. Light, however small, is still light. The clerk smiled and placed the book on the lost and found counter. He had no idea who owned it, but perhaps it had found a way to spread its light, in a different way. The next morning, Chicago was still cold. Snow was thick on the rooftops, and the sky was a dull gray, as if the sun were gone. But in the online world, a fire was burning. The video, shot at gate C14, just 3 minutes and 12 seconds long, has gone viral on social media. In the video, the young black woman is seen being prevented from boarding by a flight attendant before a man in a gray suit approaches, his voice calm but commanding. "You don't need to know who she is to treat her fairly." Within hours, the clip had been viewed more than 2 million times. The hashtags #Gate C14 and Fly with Respect were trending on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. News channels began resharing with sensational headlines. "Girl discriminated, turns out to be airline CEO's daughter." The moment that changed aviation, when power speaks for justice. Zoe didn't know anything about the storm until her plane landed in Boston. Her phone was buzzing. Over 30 text messages, hundreds of notifications. Friends, reporters, even strangers sent messages of support, sharing their feelings. She sat in the taxi on the way to the hospital, her heart pounding as she watched the news. She had no idea it would spread so far. A message from Dad. "Don't read the comments. Just remember, you did the right thing." Zoe smiled, but as she scrolled down, she saw some harsh comments. "She's only being defended because her father is a CEO. If it were a normal person, would anyone care?" She took a deep breath and put her phone back in her pocket. She knew the world was divided into two halves, trust and doubt, but she also knew that if she wanted to change, she had to accept both. In Chicago, Daniel Carter woke up in his 30th floor apartment, turned on the TV, and saw himself on the morning news. The anchor said in a stern voice, "This video is causing controversy for AeroVista Airlines." How will the airline respond to allegations of discrimination, even if the person involved is the CEO's daughter? Daniel turned off the TV and sighed. He didn't like the noise. He wanted action, not symbolism. But this time, he understood silence would be misinterpreted. He opened his laptop and composed an internal message to send to the entire system. From the desk of CEO Daniel Carter, every passenger has the right to be respected, no matter who they are. The incident at Gate C14 is a painful but necessary reminder. We will not try to cover it up. We will face it. Starting today, AeroVista will implement the Empathy First program, retraining all employees on the core values respect, equality, understanding. He read it again, then sent it off. 10 minutes later, newspapers were reprinting the statement. One journalist wrote, "Instead of avoiding it, CEO Daniel Carter has turned the incident into an opportunity to change the company's culture. This could be a historic turning point for the U.S. airline industry." In another corner of Chicago, Linda Maynard sat in her small kitchen, staring at her phone. Messages poured in from coworkers, old friends, and strangers. Some cursed, some consoled. She didn't respond. She just opened the video and watched it again. When she got to the part where Daniel said, "You don't need to know who she is to treat her fairly," tears welled up in her eyes. She wasn't angry, just embarrassed and grateful. Then the phone rang. It was Emily. "Mom." Her voice was shaking. Linda said softly, "It's me. Mom. I saw the video. Are you okay?" "Fine. I'm just learning how to be a person again." There was silence on the other end of the line for a few seconds. Then Emily said softly, "I'm proud you called me yesterday." Linda smiled, her voice choked. "I'm proud of you for picking up the phone." They both laughed. In that moment, the storm outside seemed unimportant. At the Boston hospital, Zoe sat by her mother's bedside. Marilyn Carter was weak, but her smile was radiant. "You're home," she whispered. "Yes." "Mom, I'm home." She reached out and took her son's hand. "Your father called me this morning. He said you were strong." Zoe leaned down, resting her forehead gently on her mother's hand. "I'm not strong. Mom, I'm just doing what you always taught me, being kind, even when the world is unkind." Marilyn laughed weakly. "The world needs more not strong people like you." Mother and child laughed together. Outside the window, weak sunlight filtered through the clouds. A new beginning, though cold, was still light. That afternoon, social media continued to buzz. Many people shared their own stories of being misunderstood, judged, treated unfairly. The hashtag #HeroEmpathy first went viral. A psychologist commented, "It's not because the girl is the CEO's daughter that this story went viral. It's because it touches people's fears and desires to be seen, to be heard, and to be respected." That evening, Daniel video called Zoe. His face was tired but warm on the screen. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay. Mom is better." "Good. And do you have any regrets?" Zoe shook her head. "No. If it hadn't happened, I wouldn't have known compassion could reach this far." Daniel was silent for a few seconds. "You know, tomorrow Congress is inviting me to a hearing on airline personnel policy. They want to hear about empathy first." Zoe looked surprised. "Really?" He nodded. "Maybe this is the best way to turn a bad thing into a good thing." She smiled. "Dad really knows how to turn a storm into a wind." He laughed along. "Because I learned that a headwind is only dangerous if you don't know how to keep your wings level." The father and son were silent. They both understood that. From that moment at Gate C-14, they were dealing with more than just an incident. They had touched something deeper, the awakening of a society still full of prejudice. Someone wrote online, "You may not be the CEO, nor his daughter, but you can be your own Zoe, the one who dares to stand still and not give in." That quote was shared hundreds of thousands of times. Night fell. Zoe sat by the hospital window, watching the streetlights filter through the mist. In her hand was a small notebook, the one she had left at the airport and now returned by post. The last page has a line written by my mother a long time ago. "Be a light, even when others can't see." She smiled slightly. Perhaps that light had finally found a place to shine. 3 days after the C-14 video went viral, Washington, D.C. was in the grip of an early winter chill. Snow still blanketed the roof of the Capitol, where a special hearing was held on the topic, "A Culture of Respect in American Aviation." In the large conference room, dozens of reporters, congressmen, and representatives of major airlines were present. The atmosphere was solemn but full of anticipation, because today's main guest was none other than Daniel Carter, CEO of AeroVista Airlines, whom the public called the man who silenced the whole country with just one sentence. When Daniel entered, a murmur of voices filled the room. He wore a dark blue suit and a charcoal tie, his eyes as calm as ever. He shook hands with each senator, bowing slightly. There was no pomp, just the demeanor of a man who knew he was there to speak the truth. "That's him," whispered the reporter, the one who said, "You don't need to know who she is to treat her fairly." Zoe was there too, sitting in the back of the audience. Oh, she wore a gray sweater and her hair was tied back in a bun. She didn't want to attract attention, but her presence attracted a lot of people who recognized her and took pictures. As the chair of the hearing, Senator Eleanor Bates, lightly banged her gavel, the room fell silent. "We are here today to talk about something that seems small, but touches the foundation of society, respect for human beings. Mr. Carter, you may begin." Daniel stood up, his voice deep and clear, with the slight pauses characteristic of someone used to cockpits. "Thank you. Senator Bates, I'm not here to defend my company. I'm here to share something we, as human beings, are slowly losing compassion." He looked around. All eyes were on him. 3 days ago, one of my employees misbehaved. But that mistake wasn't made out of malice. It was made out of fatigue, stress, and the habit of forgetting that behind every ticket is a human being. She was wrong, but she was also the product of a system that allows people to be emotionally numb and still function. The room was silent. One senator nodded. "I was wrong to just fire her," Daniel continued, "because that doesn't change anything. We need a culture that teaches people not just how to serve, but how to understand. That's why I started empathy first. It's not a PR campaign. It's an accountability." The sound of pens scribbling. Eleanor Bates leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, do you think this is just an airline problem?" Daniel shook his head slightly. "No. Senator, it's in every coffee shop, every office, every classroom. When we forget that everyone around us has a story, we begin to lose society." Zoe listened to her father, her heart filled with emotion. She had never seen him speak in front of such a large crowd, but he was still the father who had taught her how to stay calm in a storm. Another MP asked, "Do you think the fact that you are black has brought more attention to this?" The room murmured. Daniel paused, then smiled. "I think if I were white, the story would still be worth hearing. But if being black makes people listen more, then I'll use that opportunity to speak for those who haven't been heard." The answer moved many in the room to tears. A journalist whispered, "This is no longer a hearing. This is a lesson in humanity." After he finished his presentation, Eleanor Bates asked, "And the girl, the one in the video, is she here?" Daniel turned. His eyes met Zoe's. She nodded. "Ms. Zoe Carter, would you like to share something?" Zoe stood. The camera shutter sounded incessantly. She stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding, but her voice was soft as the wind. "I am not a hero. I am just a girl who wants to go home to her mother. But I have learned that sometimes our silence is what keeps injustice alive." She paused, looking around. "I don't want anyone to have a powerful person stand up for them in order to be respected. I just want when someone says, 'I feel I've been treated unfairly,' the listener to not react defensively, but to ask, 'Why?'" A round of applause broke out, light but sincere. Zoe bowed her head, then returned to her seat. Daniel smiled. When the hearing ended, the media exploded. Major networks such as CNN, NBC, and The Washington Post all published from airline incident to national lesson, when compassion becomes policy. That evening, Daniel returned to his hotel. He opened his laptop and saw thousands of emails from employees, customers, and strangers. Some said they cried while watching the hearing. Some said they apologized to a colleague for a thoughtless remark. He sat quietly, reading each line, feeling his heart warm. Zoe entered the room, carrying 2 cups of hot coffee. "You're still up," he smiled. "I guess we'll need another speech tomorrow." "About what?" "On how the world doesn't have to wait for a viral video to remember that kindness exists." They both laughed. Zoe put her hands on the table and looked at her father. "Are you tired?" Daniel shook his head. "No, honey. I feel hope. And that's the only thing that keeps you flying, even in storms." That night, as the city slept, Daniel wrote the last entry in his personal notebook. "The incident at Gate C-14 is not a stain, but a mirror. It reflects back what we need to see to become better." The next morning, he woke up, opened the window, and looked out at D.C. The sunlight shone on the snow-covered roofs, as if the whole city had been washed clean after a long snowfall. Zoe was still sleeping, her head resting on the small notebook, the one with her mother's words. "Light, however small, is still light." And somewhere, millions of people are starting their day with the same thought. Maybe the world would be a kinder place if everyone would just stop for a second to understand others. 2 weeks after the hearings in Washington, the Chicago sky was still overcast, the wind rustling through the bare trees. But the atmosphere inside AeroVista Airlines headquarters was different. On the wall, a large poster bore a new slogan, "Empathy First." Beneath the slogan was a simple image, a flight attendant bending down to help an elderly passenger, her gaze gentle. In the main conference room, Daniel Carter was leading the first staff meeting since the new training program was launched. About 40 people were in attendance: flight attendants, ground staff, and middle managers. None of them knew exactly what was going to happen, but they could sense the change in the atmosphere. Daniel entered, holding a cup of black coffee, his eyes gentle but firm. He did not stand on the podium, but pulled up a chair and sat in the middle of the room. "No one is here to listen to a lecture," he began. "We are here to talk about how people treat each other." Behind her sat Linda Maynard in the second row. It was her first time back since the incident. Many eyes looked at her, not with contempt, but with curiosity and perhaps sympathy. She bowed her head, her hands clasped. Daniel looked around. "I want someone to speak first. Anyone." No one spoke. The awkward atmosphere lasted for a few seconds, until Linda slowly raised her hand. "I think I should say something." The room was silent. Daniel nodded. "Thank you, Linda." She stood up. "I heard others because I thought I was doing the right thing. But in reality, I was just taking my frustrations out on someone weaker. When the video went viral, I was ashamed. I wanted to run away. But after hearing Mr. Carter's speech and seeing Zoe, I understood that running away doesn't make me feel better. Facing it does." Linda took a deep breath. "I don't want forgiveness now. I want to work to deserve it." There was a brief applause. Daniel smiled slightly. "Thank you, Linda. Honesty is the first step to compassion." He paused, looking at each person in the room. "Empathy First is not a certification course. It's a journey of relearning how to listen. Start by asking, 'Is the person next to me okay today?'" The meeting ended in a comfortable silence. No one was in a hurry to leave. Linda sat back, looking at the poster on the wall. She had not expected to be part of something so new. That afternoon, she received an internal email, an invitation to join the company's mentor crew, where experienced employees mentor new hires in customer service and understanding culture. She sat silently, tears falling. Second chances, sometimes, don't come from luck, but from sincerity. In Boston, Zoe returned to medical school. She had just completed her first internship after a leave of absence. Her classmates recognized her, and everyone mentioned the video. Some asked for pictures, but Zoe just smiled and said, "I just want to be seen as a normal student." That evening, She walked around Lake Charles, phone in hand. A new message appeared from Linda. Thank you, Zoe. I just taught my first class at Empathy First. It wasn't easy, but I felt alive. Zoe smiled and looked up at the sky. The light reflected off the water, shimmering. She didn't reply right away, just saved the message, a reminder that sometimes change is subtle, but persistent. In Chicago. Daniel sat in his office late at night, the desk lamp reflecting off the rims of his glasses. He read the weekly report. Customer satisfaction was up 28%, complaints were down nearly half. But what made him smile was the internal feedback section, hundreds of little notes, many of them from people saying they were starting to listen more to passengers. The phone rang. It was Zoe. Dad, Mom said you didn't have dinner today. Daniel laughed. Mom knows everything as usual. You need to rest. They need you well to continue to inspire. No, they need you more. You say it. I do it. Zoe laughed. Then let's do it together. They were both silent for a moment, listening to the wind whistling through the phone. Daniel said softly, You know, when people talk about the C-14 incident, they often call it the incident. But for me, it was the beginning. Everything big starts from a small collision, Zoe replied softly, like a butterfly flapping its wings in a blizzard. Daniel chuckled. You still like that metaphor? Because it's true. Dad, every change starts with a small kindness. That night, Daniel wrote a letter to all employees from the CEO office, 10:48 p.m. I don't want you to remember the C-14 incident as a mistake, but as the moment we made the right choice, when we looked up at the light, even just a ray, we were no longer in the darkness. Thank you for choosing the light. The letter was circulated internally, then unexpectedly shared externally. It became the most cited inspirational post on LinkedIn that month. A week later, AeroVista held its first test flight dedicated to autistic children, a project Zoe had suggested. Linda volunteered to lead the flight. When the plane landed, the children cheered. Linda stood in the middle of the cabin, her eyes stinging. She felt reborn. The reporter asked, Are you afraid that people will still remember your past mistakes? Linda smiled. If they do, all the better. Let them see that people can change. The quote was reprinted in hundreds of newspapers. Many saw it as a symbol of the American spirit of resilience, getting wrong, getting back up, and then getting it right. In Boston, Zoe and her mother watched the news together. Marilyn whispered, You know, maybe she saved herself, too. Zoe nodded. And the world. Mom. Her mother smiled, her thin hand taking hers. You've come further than we thought. Zoe. Outside. The winter wind blew gently. The streetlights shone through the window, warm and gentle like an open ending. 3 months later, at AeroVista headquarters, a small metal plaque hung below the company logo. On it was engraved the words Gate C-14, where we learned to be better people. No one passed by without stopping. And every time Daniel passed, he would gently touch it like a silent ritual. Zoe, from Boston, sent her father a postcard. It read, Dad, I still believe that light, no matter how small, is enough to light a long runway. Daniel read, then smiled. He looked out at the sky, where the AeroVista plane was taking off, leaving a trail of light as thin as a pen stroke. Inside him, a simple belief still burned. Kindness can go far, if enough people believe in it. The following spring, Chicago was no longer covered in snow but in warm sunshine. AeroVista Airlines headquarters looked different. More trees, more laughter in the hallways. Photos of employees helping passengers. Real smiles, real eyes, hung along the aisles. 1 year since the incident at Gate C-14, everything has changed. Not because of a media campaign, but because of a real change in people's hearts. Daniel Carter walked slowly down the 20th floor hallway. where the conference room overlooked the runway. He had just finished a call with his board of directors. The good news was that profits were up, but what made him smile wasn't the numbers, but the little statistic in the report: satisfaction with empathetic employees had increased by 91%. The door opened and Linda Maynard walked in. She looked different, her gait confident, her face radiant, the empathy trainer badge gleaming on her chest. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." "Hello, Linda. I hear you just completed your 10th training class." She smiled and nodded. "Yes, and this time I didn't cry." Daniel laughed. "That's progress." Linda sat down and looked out the window, where an AeroVista plane was taking off, leaving a trail of light. Every time I see that scene, I think about that day. But now it's not shame. It's a reminder. I'm grateful it happened. Daniel nodded, his voice soft me too. Because without the C-14 gate, we would never know that kindness can be trained like a skill, but only if it starts from the heart. They were silent for a few seconds. Linda asked softly, "What about Zoe? I hear she is doing research in community medicine." Daniel smiled proudly. "She just got a research fellowship at Harvard. She's writing a paper on the connection between social bias and healthcare." Linda laughed, her voice filled with admiration. "She was born to heal. Wasn't she like her mother?" Daniel replied, his eyes shining with tenderness. The scene shifts to Boston, on Harvard's campus. Zoe Carter sits under an old elm tree, her laptop open with a manuscript titled "Empathy as a Social Therapy." She read the opening paragraph again. When a person feels listened to, their body responds as if it is being healed. And perhaps social healing begins with listening to each other, not just healing. Zoe stopped and smiled. She remembered the days at the airport gate, her father's voice, Linda's face when she cried. All those images, now like a string of beautiful memories, no longer a wound. Her phone vibrated, a video call from her dad. "Are you busy writing?" "Yes." "Dad, I'm trying to make this essay less dry." Daniel smiled. "With you, nothing is dry. You always make everything emotional." Zoe chuckled. "You know, there's a student in my class who wants to do research on empathy first. She said your story made her choose medicine." Daniel was silent, looking at his daughter. "I don't teach kindness, Zoe. I just model it." Zoe nodded, her eyes moist. "I know. But sometimes you have to see the light to believe it's real." Both were silent, only the light wind blowing across the screen. That afternoon in Chicago, AeroVista held an event to celebrate the first anniversary of its Empathy First program. Hundreds of employees, passengers, and representatives from other airlines gathered. Daniel stepped onto the stage, warmly lit. "A year ago, we made mistakes," he said slowly, his voice steady. "But those mistakes made us better. I have always believed that kindness cannot be enacted by policy. It must be chosen every day, by every person." He paused, then smiled. "Today, I want to honor the person who reminded me of that. None other than Linda Maynard." Applause filled the hall. Linda stepped onto the stage, her eyes red. Daniel presented her with the Honor of Empathy certificate, the company's highest award. Linda took the microphone and said softly, "If I can change, anyone can. And if you're watching this somewhere, I want to say, don't let one mistake define you. Let how you get up do that." The whole hall stood up and applauded profusely. A young employee filmed the scene and posted it online with the caption, "It wasn't the CEO. It wasn't his daughter. It was the person who made me believe in the power of change." The video went viral again, but this time, not because of scandal, but because of hope, in a small coffee shop in Boston. Zoe opened her phone and watched the clip. She smiled and leaned back. Across the coffee shop, a young woman approached. "Are you Zoe Carter?" "You don't know. I used to be an airline employee. After I saw the video last year, I quit to study psychology. I want to help people feel heard. Zoe paused, then took the girl's hand. Thank you for saying that. Sometimes just one story at the right time can save a life. They laughed, amid soft jazz music. Final scene: sunset over a Chicago runway. Daniel stands looking at an AeroVista plane with its new logo, a pair of wings enclosing a heart. On the tail, small letters read, "Empathy First." Linda walked over to him and handed him a large print of the photo of him and Zoe standing together at the Capitol Hill hearing. I think this should hang in the lobby. Daniel looked at the photograph. In it, he and his daughter stood side by side, the light shining through the window as if the sky were smiling. He nodded. Hang it there, so that anyone who passes by will remember that we fell. But we chose to get up. Linda smiled. And that light hasn't gone out yet. The afternoon wind blew, carrying the children's laughter from the waiting area. Daniel looked up at the sky. It was no longer gloomy like that day. There was only a vast, peaceful, and distant blue. In Boston, Zoe ended her essay with a single sentence. When people choose to understand rather than judge, society will no longer need hearings to prove that goodness still exists. She saved the file, then looked out the window. The last light of day shone on the wall, reflecting into her eyes. In that moment, Zoe knew the story at Gate C-14 was no longer theirs. It had become the story of everyone who believed that a small act could make the world a better place. October, a year since the incident at Gate C-14 shook America. Chicago was milder than usual, the wind not as bitter as before. At O'Hare Airport, AeroVista Airlines held a celebration called Empathy First, a year of compassion. Banners hung all over the lobby, but not colorful, just a pure white background, with blue letters, from C-14 to every heart. Daniel Carter stood backstage, adjusting his tie. Even though he had spoken to thousands of people over the past year, his hands were shaking slightly today. Outside, hundreds of employees, customers, and representatives from other airlines had gathered. Among the crowd were faces who had witnessed the incident: police officers, gate agents, passengers, and, of course, Linda Maynard. Linda walked into the back room, smiling brightly. Ready, Mr. Carter? Daniel turned back, smiling. You say that as if I'm the one being honored. Linda laughed. Isn't it? You're the one who got us all here. No, he replied warmly. We do it all here. Linda was silent for a few seconds, then nodded. Thank you, Daniel. I thought no one would want to hear me speak again after that day. Daniel put his hand on her shoulder. People need to listen to you. Linda, no one learns compassion from a perfect person. The loudspeaker blared, signaling the start of the show. They stepped onto the stage to applause. The spotlights reflected off Daniel's glasses, casting a soft glow. A year ago, we learned a hard lesson. Sometimes the best things come from the most embarrassing moments, he began. And without that mistake, we wouldn't have empathy first. We wouldn't have thousands of employees who know how to look passengers in the eye before making judgments. The room was silent. He looked down at Zoe, who was sitting in the front row. She waved, her smile warming the stage lights. Daniel continued, Today, I don't want to dwell on the past. I want to talk about the future, where kindness is not the exception, but the norm. He invited Linda to speak. She took the microphone, her eyes sparkling. I thought I would never be here, but life always has a second way. When AeroVista gave me a chance, I realized that the miracle is not in people forgiving me, but in learning to forgive myself. Now, every time I board a plane, I no longer see passengers as a task. I see them as untold stories. The applause was prolonged. A few staff members wiped away tears. Linda smiled, looking at Daniel. Thank you. Thank you, Zoe. for not giving up on me when I stopped believing in myself. Zoe stood up, walked up to the stage, and hugged Linda. It was a simple hug, but it made the audience explode. After the ceremony, Zoe stepped out of the airport and took a deep breath. The October air was cool, the smell of coffee mixed with the autumn breeze. A group of reporters approached, asking for an interview. One asked, "Zoe, did you ever think you would become a symbol of change?" She laughed. "I don't think any of us are icons. We're just people who didn't look away." Another journalist asked, "Are you still afraid of misunderstandings?" Zoe smiled, her eyes calm. "If you live authentically, people may misunderstand. But if you live fakely, you will definitely misunderstand yourself." The quote was broadcast live, and within hours, it was again a viral quote. But this time, there was no controversy, just gratitude. That evening, Daniel and Zoe sat in the small restaurant downtown, the place where they often ate. On the table was Zoe's mother's favorite chicken soup. Zoe looked out the window, where the first snow of the season was beginning to fall. "Dad, I still think about that day, that, if it hadn't happened, I probably would never have understood all the things you've faced throughout your career." Daniel nodded slightly, his eyes deep. "You know, when I was young, I thought power was the best way to change the world. But after all, I realized that only kindness can truly do that." Zoe smiled, her voice light as the wind. "I think Mom would say the same thing." The two of them were silent, watching the snow fall. At the next table, a group of young AeroVista employees recognized them, but no one came to bother them. They just clinked glasses and said to each other, "They are the ones who made us believe that kindness still has value." The next day, Daniel received an envelope with no sender's name. Inside was a photo of Gate C-14, where it all began. In the corner of the photo, a handwritten line read, "I was a passenger that day. I saw everything. Now, every time I fly, I always smile at the staff. Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists." Daniel held the photo for a long time, then carefully placed it in a frame and hung it in his office. He stood still, looking out the window at the runway. An AeroVista had just left the ground, slowly rising up into the deep blue sky. In Boston, Zoe receives an email from Linda. "I was training a new group of employees. They asked me, if it hadn't happened, would you have changed?" I said, "Probably not. So, maybe sometimes, fate also knows how to teach people, through pain. But if we know how to listen, that pain becomes a gift." Zoe read, then looked up at the window. The yellow sunlight fell on her desk, reflecting off the picture of her father standing on Capitol Hill. She whispered to herself, "The light never goes out. It just changes shape." Ending scene. Late afternoon at Gate C-14. An elderly passenger is struggling with his oversized luggage. A young staff member approaches, smiling. "Let me help you." The old man nods in thanks. Behind him, on the wall, is an old metal sign, Gate C-14, where we learn to be better people. The camera lingered there, and the background music gradually played, warm, deep, and hopeful. A voice spoke up, as if to summarize. "People often say that light only makes sense when darkness appears. But sometimes, it is people who know how to light each other that make this world continue to be warm. And if you have ever been misunderstood or stumbled, remember that. Maybe that is the beginning of the journey to make you kinder." January. The Boston sky was a cold gray, and snowflakes were falling lightly against the glass windows of Zoe's dorm room. Her laptop was open, her thesis nearly complete, but her eyes couldn't focus. Her phone vibrated constantly, the name on the screen Linda Maynard. Zoe quickly picked up the phone. Linda's voice rang out, trembling. "Zoe, Mr. Carter, is in the Chicago hospital." Zoe's heart dropped. "What happened?" Linda choked up. "He collapsed in his office. They said it was his heart." The pen in Zoe's hand fell to the table. She stood up, her heart pounding. "I'll fly." She quickly packed up her laptop, grabbed her e-ticket, and rushed out of the room into the blinding snowstorm. In Chicago, Memorial Hospital lit up on the 5th floor. Daniel Carter lay in bed, an oxygen tube in his nose. The doctors said he had heart failure from prolonged stress. They told him he was lucky if he had been 10 minutes later. It might have been different. Linda sat in the hallway, clutching a cold cup of coffee. She had been there for 6 hours, without moving. Each beep of the heart monitor was a beat of anxiety in her heart. The door opened and Zoe ran in, her coat covered in snow, her eyes red. Linda stood up and walked quickly to hug her. "He's fine, but the doctor said he needs a long rest." Zoe nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. Linda, if you hadn't called, I wouldn't have known." Linda looked at her, smiling sadly. "You owe him your life. You can't help but call." Zoe walked into the hospital room. Daniel lay still, his face calm. She sat down next to him and held his hand. Her father's hand was warm, but weak. "Dad, it's me," she said softly. Daniel opened his eyes, looked at his daughter, and smiled. "Zoe, you're home." "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" He tried to smile. "I don't want you to worry. You have your thesis." Zoe hiccuped. "I don't need a thesis without you." Daniel squeezed her hand. "No, Zoe, I want you to keep going. The light shouldn't stop for me." She shook her head, tears falling. "I don't care about light or dark. I just need you." Daniel looked deep into his son's eyes. "Remember what I told you, that kindness never dies. It just passes from one person to another. Now it's your turn to continue." Zoe bowed her head and hugged her father. "I promise." In the following days, Daniel had to stay in the hospital for observation. Zoe stayed in Chicago, canceling all her classes. Linda helped her arrange accommodation, brought her food, and was always by her side. One afternoon, while Daniel slept, Zoe and Linda sat on the hospital balcony, watching the snow fall. Linda whispered, "Zoe, he's like the airport lights. Even in strong winds, the lights stay on. But everyone forgets that they need to change their bulbs." Zoe smiled sadly. "You burn too much for others." Linda nodded. "It's your turn to hold the light now." On the 10th day, Daniel was discharged from the hospital. The doctor advised him to take a break from work for at least 6 months, but he remained silent and did not object. Zoe walked him home. His high-rise apartment overlooked the city, the lights reflecting in the glass windows like a small sky. "I'll be here for a few months," Zoe said. Daniel laughed. "Who will do my thesis?" "I will write here, next to you, Dad." In the following days, Zoe worked at her father's bedside, reading papers and writing paragraphs. Daniel read the newspaper, listened to jazz music, and occasionally gave him feedback. They ate breakfast together, drank tea, and laughed more than before. One evening, Zoe was typing when Daniel whispered, "Do you know what I fear most?" "What is it, Dad?" "People will forget the true meaning of empathy first. I'm afraid it will become a slogan, no longer a breath." Zoe stopped and looked at him. "I won't let that happen." Daniel smiled, his eyes sparkling. "I believe you, but you have to promise me one thing. What when Dad is gone, I will continue to fly, in my own way." Zoe took his hand and nodded. "I promise." February, a year and a half after the incident at C-14, AeroVista held its annual winter event. Daniel couldn't attend, but he sent a short video. In it, he sat in a room, his voice deep and warm. "We are all lamp bearers. Don't wait for someone else to light your lamp. Because every time you are kind, you light up the whole world. The video ends with Zoe standing next to him, morning light streaming through the window. The clip went viral, shared by millions of people. Many commented, "If a CEO can say that, there must be hope for the world." A month later, Zoe finished her thesis. She sent it to her father to read before handing it in. Daniel read it and simply said, "I'm not writing about medicine. I'm writing about humanity." She smiled. "I learned from you, Dad." On the day of her thesis defense, Daniel watched the video online. When the committee chair asked, "What makes you believe that compassion can change the system?" Zoe smiled and replied, "Because I saw it change me, and my father." The whole room was silent, then applauded. A month later, Zoe graduated. She didn't invite reporters, didn't make a fuss. Only Daniel, Linda, and a few close friends attended. As she walked out of the hall, Daniel hugged his daughter for a long time. "I flew," he said. His voice choked. "Me too," Zoe replied. The sky was unusually clear that day. By spring, Daniel was feeling better, but still walking slowly. He stepped down from his executive role and took on an honorary advisory role. AeroVista started a new foundation called the Carter Foundation, Lights of Empathy. The foundation supports empathy training for students, service, and medical staff. On the day the fund was launched, Zoe gave a speech in place of her father. Her voice was warm and steady. "We cannot change the world in one day, but we can change someone's day with one kind act." She looked up at the thousands of people in the audience, knowing that the light her father had lit was no longer just his. It had spread everywhere. That evening, father and son sat by the window, watching the planes fly over the city. Daniel whispered, "Zoe, I see your mother in all the lights." She leaned her head gently on his shoulder. "Me too, Dad." Outside, the airport lights twinkled like stars. The last flight of winter slowly took off, drawing a long streak of light across the sky, a streak of compassion, of forgiveness, of people who dared to believe that the light never disappeared. It just found another way back. 3 years after the incident at Gate C-14, the Chicago sky was clear. The golden sunlight stretched across the glittering runways. The city was still noisy, but inside the 35th floor apartment on the shores of Lake Michigan, the air was strangely calm. Daniel Carter sat by the window, a thin blanket draped over his knees. He was weaker than before. His hair was almost completely gray, but his eyes were still bright, like the night lights of an airport. Zoe sat opposite, writing and occasionally looking up at her father. She had become a young lecturer at Harvard, teaching empathy leadership. "What are you writing?" Daniel asked, his voice hoarse but warm. Zoe smiled, tapping away at the keyboard. "I'm finishing my first book manuscript. It's called The Light That Stayed." Daniel nodded. "That's a nice name. But remember, light isn't just for guidance. It's for warmth, too." She nodded, her eyes softening. "I know, Dad." They were silent for a moment. Only the sound of the wall clock and the wind outside the door could be heard. After a heart attack 3 years ago, Daniel stepped back from his executive role. He spends his time writing, teaching, and sharing the empathy-first story around the world. He doesn't fly as much anymore, but his voice is heard farther than ever. One morning, Zoe received an email from the organizers of the Global Human Leadership Summit. It read, "We would like to present the International Humanitarian Award to Daniel Carter, who has inspired the world with his kindness." She read it over and over again, her heart filled with pride. But when she told her father, Daniel just smiled slightly. "I don't need any awards." "Zoe, just knowing the light is still spreading is enough." "You have to," Zoe insisted. "Not for the glory, but for the people you changed. They need to see that good can prevail." Daniel looked at his daughter. his eyes warm and filled with pride. Just like you. The New York auditorium was packed on the day of the award ceremony. Zoe took the stage in her father's place. On the big screen, a video he had recorded from his apartment was shown. I used to believe that the power of a company lay in its profits. Now, I believe that its true power lies in how we treat people. I am old, but I know, every time someone chooses to be kind, the world is a better day. When the video ended, the entire auditorium stood up and applauded. Zoe bowed her head, tears streaming down her face. That evening, she video called her father. Daniel sat by the window, the moonlight shining on his gentle smile. I think you speak well, he joked. Now I know what an inspiring daughter I have. You are the reason I can say those words, Zoe replied softly. He smiled, then mused. Zoe, do you believe in legacy? Yes, Dad. I don't think legacy is what we leave behind, but who we leave behind, and to me, you are the best legacy. The statement made Zoe choke. In the following months, Daniel's health deteriorated, but he continued to write. Short articles, just a few lines, but they spread strongly on social networks. One of them was shared millions of times. Be kind while you still can. Because one day, that kindness will be the most beautiful echo about you. November, a light rainy afternoon in Chicago. Zoe flew back from Boston, bringing with her a completed copy of The Light That Stayed. She intended to give her father the first copy. When she entered the apartment, it was quiet. Daniel was asleep on the sofa, his notebook open in front of him. Zoe stepped closer and touched his hand. It was still warm, but his breathing was soft. On the last page, Daniel wrote a line. The light does not belong to me, but to... Zoe placed her hand on the word belong, tears falling into the ink. She whispered, belong to all who believe that love can change the world. Daniel's funeral was simple, just as he had wished. No lavish flowers, no media, just people who had worked with him, who had been helped by him, and passengers who had met him even once. Linda Maynard arrived, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. She placed it next to the portrait and whispered, Thank you, Daniel. Thanks to you. I know it's never too late to be a good person. Zoe stood beside her, holding her hand. They were both crying, but they were warm tears. A week later, Zoe returned to Harvard. In her first class after the funeral, she opened the lecture with a quote from her father. Leadership is not about standing at the top, but about bending down and listening. The class was silent. One student raised his hand and asked, Miss Zoe, was Mr. Daniel Carter real, or is he just a legend? Zoe smiled, her eyes distant. He is real, and every time you choose to listen to someone with your heart, he is still alive. The following month, AeroVista renamed its main domestic airport Daniel Carter Terminal. At Gate C-14, where it all began, a small plaque was erected that read, Where one act of kindness changed the world. Passers-by often stopped to read, many smiling, some shedding tears. Zoe returned there late one afternoon. She stood still, watching the planes fly by, the cool wind blowing through her hair. Linda appeared behind her and whispered, I can still feel him somewhere. Zoe nodded. He never left, just flew away. They both looked up at the sky. An AeroVista with a heart-shaped logo took off, the sunset reflecting off the fuselage, glowing like a living flame. When I leave this earth, I don't want people to remember me as a CEO. I want them to remember that I stopped, listened, and chose to love. Because this world, no matter how many times it stumbles, still needs a little light from every heart that still believes. Zoe stands alone in the middle of the hall, the wind blowing her skirt, the afternoon sun shining on her body. She smiles slightly, puts her hand on her chest, as if feeling her father's heartbeat still there. The screen gradually darkened, leaving only white text. Empathy isn't a policy. It's a choice. And some choices last forever. 2 years have passed since Daniel Carter left this world. Time has passed, but his legacy has not faded. It has spread, like the morning light in the sky after a storm. Zoe Carter is now 29. She is no longer the student who was insulted at the airport gate. Today, she is a PhD, a university lecturer, and the face of a global program called Empathy in Action, a project directly inspired by her father's story. One morning in New York, Zoe stepped onto the podium at the World Humanistic Leadership Conference. Behind her, a screen projected the words, "Empathy is not weakness, it's wisdom." She began in a slow, natural voice, as if telling a story. When I was 19, I was humiliated by a flight attendant in front of dozens of people. I was scared. I was angry. But then I saw my father step forward, not with power, but with calmness and kindness. He didn't protect me out of anger. He did it out of compassion. The room fell silent. Zoe's voice was shaky, but powerful. My father used to say, "True strength is not reaction, it is reflection." And I understand that compassion is not weakness. It is courage in the form of understanding. She paused, looking around the room. Today, I want to introduce something. The Empathy First Academy, an online program created to teach empathy to the next generation of global youth. We're partnering with AeroVista and over 40 universities around the world to teach that you can be a leader and still be human. Applause broke out. The camera panned slowly to the audience, who were shedding tears, not out of pity, but because they recognized themselves in the story. After the talk, a young reporter approached Zoe. "Dr. Carter, do you think a story can change the world?" Zoe smiled. "Not a story. It's when that story inspires others to tell it their own way." That evening, Zoe returned to the hotel. She sat by the window, looking out at the bright Manhattan streets. In her hand was the old letter, the last one Daniel had left her before he died. She read it again, for the 100th time. "Dear Zoe, if you are reading this, I may have flown away, but the light is not lost. It just changes shape. I don't need you to continue my legacy. I just need you to continue being kind. When you see someone being treated unfairly, don't turn away. Remember, you can't change the world, but you can change one person's world. I love you. Always. Dad." Zoe folded the letter and put it in her pocket. She knew she was ready for the next step. A few months later, she and Linda Maynard launched the first pilot program in Chicago, the very place where it all began. Gate C-14 is now decorated with photos of people helping each other, a worker helping an elderly person, a little girl being hugged after losing her mother. Linda, now AeroVista's training director, walked beside Zoe, whispering, "Every time I see this gate, I remember that day. But now I don't feel guilty. I feel grateful." Zoe took her hand. "You didn't just change yourself. You changed the airline industry?" Linda laughed, her eyes shining with pride. "No, it was your father who did that." They stopped at the spot where Daniel had stood years ago. Zoe looked up, the light reflecting off the glass ceiling, forming crisscrossing streaks of light. She whispered, "Dad, I'm still here. Your light is still there." A month later, Empathy First Academy officially launched globally. Within 48 hours, there were more than 1.5 million registrations. Thousands of businesses and nonprofits joined. On social media, the hashtag #TheLightThatStayed became a top trend. A middle-aged woman in Texas shared, "I used to be a grumpy person, tired of everything. But when Zoe told me about her father, I burst into tears. I realized I had forgotten what it felt like to be a nice person." An airline employee in Japan wrote, "I told Daniel Carter's story to my flight crew. We call it the C-14 effect, where compassion takes flight." Zoe read each comment, smiling silently. A year later, At Harvard, she was invited to give a special lecture to new students. The lecture was called The Light That Stayed. When she stepped onto the stage, the auditorium was packed. She opened by showing an old video of Daniel standing in front of Parliament talking about empathy first. When the video ended, Zoe stepped to the edge of the stage, her voice low but clear. My father taught me that if you are brave enough to listen, you can hear the pain others are afraid to speak. And if you are patient enough to understand, you can heal the wounds you cannot see. The whole audience stood up. The applause was long and endless. As the class ended, a student approached, eyes filled with tears. Dr. Carter, do you think I, an ordinary person, can make a difference? Zoe put her hand on the young girl's shoulder and smiled. If my father were still alive, he would say, you don't have to do anything big. Just start by not looking away. That evening, Zoe returned to her old apartment in Chicago, where she still kept her father's room. She opened the window, letting the night breeze in. The moonlight reflected off the smiling photo of Daniel. She turned on the old radio, the jazz music her father loved playing. She closed her eyes and whispered, Dad, your light is not only in me, but in millions of people out there. Outside, an AeroVista plane flew by, its lights flashing in the darkness, reflecting off Lake Michigan. In its light, Daniel seemed to smile. No story ever really ends, because every time someone chooses kindness, the story begins again. And if you are listening to this, remember, you too can be the light that helps someone find their way home. 10 years have passed since the incident at Gate C-14. Time is long enough to erase memories, but not long enough to extinguish a fire that has ignited in the hearts of millions of people. The world now remembers Daniel Carter as the man who changed the way the airline industry and beyond looked at compassion. But his legacy is more than just a training program or a book. It's a movement, a wave, a reminder. Be kind when you can. Morning in Singapore. In the Grand Hall of the Empathy in Action Global Forum, Zoe Carter stood among thousands of people from 42 countries. Below, different flags waved, creating a vibrant sea of color. She wore a simple white shirt, her voice low but resonant. More than 10 years ago, my father was considered weak because he chose kindness, but it was that kindness that made him stronger than any power. Today, I look around and see a miracle. Compassion is no longer a concept. It has become an action. On a giant screen behind her, a video shows ordinary people doing small things, a driver in Kenya stopping to help a stranger cross the street, a doctor in Canada hugging a patient after surgery, an airline employee in Tokyo bowing to an elderly person. These are the new heroes, Zoe said. They don't wear capes, they don't have titles, but they light up the world every day. The audience stood up and applauded. The applause was not just for Zoe, but for everyone who believed that humanity still had room for kindness. Linda Maynard, now in her 60s, sat in the front row. Her eyes sparkled with pride as she looked at Zoe. After retiring, Linda continued to serve as an honorary advisor to the Empathy First Academy. She once said in an interview, "If someone like me who made mistakes can change, then anyone can. Compassion excludes no one. It just waits for us to open our hearts." That evening, Zoe and Linda had dinner at a small restaurant overlooking Marina Bay. The city lit up like a giant mirror. "Zoe," Linda said, "I think if Daniel saw this, he would smile with satisfaction." Zoe smiled slightly. "He won't say anything. You know, all he'll say is, 'We're just getting started.'" They both laughed. Zoe looked out at the night sky, where the lights reflected off the tall buildings. "Linda, sometimes I get scared. This movement is so big. I'm just one person." Linda put her hand on her shoulder. "I used to think I was small too, but Daniel once told me, A light doesn't have to be big to shine. It just has to be real. You're doing that? The words made Zoe silent. A sense of peace crept into her heart, as if the wind were caressing her soul. The next day, she flew to India to attend a conference with students. The flight lasted 19 hours, but she was not tired. When she landed in Mumbai, she was greeted by hundreds of students holding signs. "Welcome, Dr. Zoe Carter, the light that stayed." She laughed. "Dad, see, your light is now printed on posters." During the talk, a student asked Ms. Zoe, "Have you ever hated the person who hurt you that year?" Zoe was silent for a few seconds, then replied, "No, because if I held on to hatred, I would have no room for compassion. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is choosing not to let the past define your present." The answer silenced the room. A student sitting in the front row burst into tears. After the talk, he went up to her, held her hand, and said, "You saved me. I used to think kindness was a weakness. Now I know it is the only strength that never runs out." Zoe smiled, squeezing his hand. "It is my own light." On the way back to the hotel, Zoe turned on her phone. Social media was flooded with videos of the conversation. The hashtag #YouEmpathyInAction was trending worldwide. But what touched her most was a simple comment. From an account called Passenger 14, "I was the one who witnessed her story at the airport that year. Now I tell it to my son. And every time we fly, he always says, 'Mommy, smile at the flight attendant.'" Zoe read that, tears falling onto the phone. A year later, she was invited to Washington, D.C., to speak at the United Nations at a conference on compassion and global policy. She carried a picture of her father with her, placing it on the podium. At the end of her speech, representatives from many countries agreed to sign the Empathy Pact, pledging to include compassion, education, and national school curricula. That night, Zoe sat by the lake, watching the moon reflect on the water. She turned on the old tape recorder. Her father's voice rang out, faint but clear. "If you are hearing this, it means the light is still there, and you are the one who carries it further." She smiled and said softly, "Dad, the light is not only here, it is spreading all over the world." A week later, in Chicago, AeroVista opened a small museum called the Carter Legacy Hall. Inside were artifacts, a watch Daniel had worn, a letter Zoe had written to him, and a notebook with his last unfinished words. On the main wall, a quote of his is engraved, "Compassion cannot save the world, but it can save the humanity in each of us." On the opening day, thousands of people came to visit. Many stopped for a long time in front of the photo of Daniel holding Zoe at the ceremony. One little girl asked her mother, "Mommy, who is he?" The mother bent down and smiled. "He is the one who taught the world how to be kind." Zoe walks out of the museum, the Chicago wind blowing hard. She looks up at the sky, where an AeroVista plane is taking off, the sunset reflecting off the fuselage. Every light begins with a spark. And when we choose kindness, we become that spark, even for just a moment, enough for someone to find their way home. 20 years after the incident at Gate C-14, the world has changed, but the name Daniel Carter is still remembered as a symbol of compassion in turbulent times. One early autumn morning in Geneva, Switzerland, the new headquarters of the Global Humanist Alliance was inaugurated. The glass building reflected the blue sky, and in the middle of the main lobby was a bronze statue of Daniel Carter, smiling, holding a pilot's helmet, looking forward. On the stone pedestal, the words were engraved in 5 languages. "Empathy is our flight path. Zoe Carter." Now 39 stepped onto the podium among hundreds of national representatives. She was slim but strong. Her hair was slightly silver, and she smiled gently like her father. "My father used to say," she began, "that the world doesn't need more debaters. It needs more listeners. 20 years ago, we saw that. From a small Chicago airport, That story traveled around the planet. She pointed to the large screen behind her, which showed images of children in Africa learning to put themselves in someone else's shoes in class, police officers in Canada practicing empathy skills, and health workers in Europe hugging patients after work. Zoe smiled, her eyes warm. That is the legacy of light. It belongs to no one, but to all of us. Applause broke out. Many people shed tears. In the audience, Linda Maynard, now in her 70s, quietly wiped away tears. She told reporters, "I never thought a mistake in my life would become the beginning of something so good." After the ceremony, Zoe stepped out onto the balcony, overlooking the calm Lake Geneva. Linda leaned on her cane and came over to her. Smiling, "Zoe, I just met a girl named Amara. She said after hearing your story, she wants to be a flight attendant, so she can help others feel safe every day." Zoe turned back and took her hand. "You see, the light spread far." Linda nodded slightly, her eyes glistening. "And it started on my worst day. Maybe. Sometimes God picks us out by falling." They both laughed. That afternoon, Zoe went for a walk along the lake. The wind blew through the maple trees. She stopped by a group of children playing, and the youngest one ran up and asked, "Miss, who is that man in the statue?" Zoe leaned down and smiled. "He is the one who taught the world that being kind is also a way to be strong." "Like you?" the boy asked. She laughed, ruffling his hair. "No, like you, if you choose to love." That simple saying was accidentally recorded by a journalist and posted on social media with the title, "The Girl Who Taught the World to Care." The article went viral and was translated into more than 20 languages. A month later, Zoe was invited to speak at Stanford University, where she had attended at 19, where it all began. As she walked onto the stage, she paused for a long time in front of a small plaque in memory of Daniel Carter in the middle of the lobby. She spoke slowly, her voice full of emotion. 20 years ago, I was just a young girl who was insulted at the airport gate. I was angry. I wanted to drop out of school. I thought the world was unfair. But then, it was my father's kindness that taught me that justice does not come from retaliating, but from choosing to understand." The whole room was absolutely silent. Back then, I didn't understand why my father didn't get angry. Now I know, because he understood that anger only breeds more anger. Only compassion can break that cycle. When she finished, the students rose to their feet and applauded loudly. A professor stepped onto the stage and said, choking back tears, "Zoe, today you are not just a successor. You have become the light of a new generation." After her talk, Zoe walked around the old campus. It was dusk. The wind carried the scent of wet grass. She stopped in the corner of the yard where she used to sit and call her father. Now there was only the sound of the wind, but in her heart she heard his voice, gentle and steady. "You did well. Zoe, I always believed that the light would find its way to heaven." She smiled slightly, her eyes brimming with tears. A year later, in Chicago, O'Hare Airport renamed its new international wing the Carter International Wing. During the opening ceremony, Zoe cut the ribbon, sunlight streaming through the glass ceiling onto a gold plaque engraved with the words dedicated to Daniel and Zoe Carter for teaching the world to fly with empathy. Zoe bowed her head, tears streaming down her face, but a smile remained. She knew her father was somewhere there, probably watching her, smiling proudly. That night, she returned to her father's old apartment in Chicago. The room was exactly as it had always been, the old radio, the faded teacups, and the family photo on the table. She turned on the light and took out the diary Daniel had written in. On the last page, his handwriting was weak but steady. "If one day you find the darkness too thick, remember, just light a small ray of light. That is enough." Zoe closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and smiled. I lit it, Dad, and it never went out. Sometimes, we don't need to do great things to change the world. We just need to choose to be kind, at the right time, to the right people. Because light does not come from the lamp above, but from the hearts that give light to each other. The screen gradually turned black. Only a faint white line appeared. Legacy of light. The sky belongs to those who care. The story, flight attendant calls cops. On black girl freezes. When her airline CEO dad walks in is not just about a moment of humiliation, but also a journey of healing. It reminds us that in a world filled with haste and prejudice, compassion is still the most powerful thing. Daniel Carter, a father, a black CEO who has experienced a lot of prejudice, did not choose to get angry. He chose to be calm, to choose dialogue, to choose humanity. It was that choice that changed the life of his daughter, of the erring flight attendant, and of a world lost in prejudice. The lesson is clear. Power lies not in the loudest voice, but in the quietest heart. Forgiveness does not weaken us. It sets us free. Kindness costs us nothing, but gives others a reason to believe in goodness. For older audiences, this story is a gentle reminder that no matter how many years have passed, kindness is still the only guiding light that helps the next generation find the light. If this story touches you, please like, share to spread the message of compassion, and subscribe to our channel to continue our journey of telling stories that heal hearts. Because who knows, you might be the little light that illuminates the world tomorrow.